In the perfect world of the King's Gate HOA, Eleanor Vance was the enforcer. So when she saw a young black teenager on her street, she didn't ask questions. She yelled, she gave chase. In her mind, she was in complete control, protecting her community. But in the middle of her pursuit, everything changes in an instant. A sudden fall, a shattered ankle, and what happens next is the moment that will haunt her forever. The boy she was chasing stops, and he turns back to help. This is the story of how that single act of cruelty, met with an unbelievable act of grace, became one woman's biggest regret in life. Join us as we unravel the surprising and difficult path that follows. We invite you to share your first impressions in the comments. And if you enjoy stories that explore the deeper truths of our lives, please consider subscribing to Deepucator Stories. The sound of a fracture. The silence in the private hospital room was absolute, a sterile, unnerving quiet that felt heavier than any sound. Eleanor Vance stared at the ceiling. A perfect, seamless landscape of white acoustic tile. Her right ankle was a prisoner, locked away inside a thick block of plaster. It throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a constant reminder of gravity and brittle bones. But that pain, it was nothing compared to the sharp, splintering agony that seized her whenever she dared to close her eyes, because in the darkness behind her lids, she didn't see rest. She saw the face of a teenage boy, his skin a deep brown that stood out against the pale perfection of King's Gate. She saw his eyes, wide with a fear she had put there. And she heard a voice, her own, screaming words that felt like they had been ripped from someone else's throat. A strange, ugly sound. It was the sound of her life's biggest regret. A regret that was no longer just a feeling. It now had a shape, a weight, and it was pinning her to this starched, white bed. Just days ago, the world had been drenched in the unforgiving sun of a North Carolina summer. The air in King's Gate was thick and still, and Eleanor's face was flush with a heat that had nothing to do with the weather. She was chasing him. The boy, Julian Hayes, was moving backwards down the immaculate sidewalk, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. "Get out of here," she shouted, the words tearing through the neighborhood's curated peace. Her phone was in her hand, held out not to call anyone, but as a threat, a weapon. "People like you don't belong in this place. People like you." The phrase had slipped out so easily, so naturally, she hadn't even thought about it. But she knew what she meant. He didn't fit. The way he walked, the hoodie he wore in the middle of summer, it was all wrong. He was a variable she couldn't account for. A dark shape moving through her sun-bleached world. Julian, all lanky limbs and startled confusion, tried to keep a safe distance. But in the blinding glare of Eleanor's fury, she saw something else entirely. A disruption. A threat. Her vision was narrow, focused only on him. She didn't see the tiny fissure in the concrete path ahead. A small crack. An imperfection. The kind of thing that she, in her official capacity as a member of the HOA, would have photographed and reported without a moment's hesitation. Her sensible walking shoe caught the raised edge. Her ankle rolled. There was a sound, a dry, sickening crack. It was sharp and final, a sound that cut through her rage and left a void. Her forward momentum betrayal here. And she fell. The fall was clumsy and graceless. Her body hit the perfectly manicured lawn with a heavy thud. The fury evaporated, replaced by a white-hot, blinding pain and an even more profound humiliation. She looked up, her vision blurred with tears. The boy had stopped. He turned around, and his face, the very target of her hatred just seconds before, was now filled with an unmistakable, gut-wrenching alarm. That was the last image she saw clearly. The image of the threat, turning back. That morning had started like every other morning since her husband, Arthur, had passed. With order, with control. Her home was a silent, cold museum of a life that once was. She ate her breakfast, one piece of dry toast and black coffee at the large dining table, sitting alone. The empty chair across from her a constant, quiet accusation. After breakfast came the ritual. For hours, she would sit at Arthur's old desk, poring over the financial reports of the Homeowners Association HOA. Then, she would conduct her patrol. She would drive her silent sedan through the winding streets, her eyes scanning for violations. A trash bin left out too early, a basketball hoop with a frayed net, an unapproved set of wind chimes. This was her purpose. Now, controlling the rules of the HOA was the only way she knew how to control the suffocating chaos of her own grief. She told herself she was protecting the community's safety, its property values. She was keeping things clean, predictable. But the truth was deeper and sadder. She was building a wall of rules and regulations to keep out a world she no longer trusted. A world that felt messy and unpredictable without Arthur in it. The jarring ring of her cell phone pulled her back to the hospital room. It was her son, David. His voice on the line was strained, heavy with a disappointment that hurt more than any anger could. "Mom." To the video. "It's everywhere." He didn't try to explain. "A moment later." Her phone buzzed with a new message. It was a link. His text beneath it was simple. "I'm so sorry. Mom. UN." Eleanor felt a cold confusion. Video. What video? Her breath caught in her throat. Black teen. They had named it. The thing she had only allowed herself to think in coded terms. She watched the shaky footage. She saw herself, a stranger with her face twisted in a mask of rage. She heard her own voice, shrill and cruel, shouting those awful words. "People like you." She watched herself chase the boy. She watched herself fall. The camera didn't stop. It captured Julian's hesitation. And then his decision. It captured him running back to her, kneeling beside her, his calm voice cutting through her pained cries. Below the video, the numbers were like a punch to the gut. Millions of views. And the comments. An endless scroll of judgment. She saw it. She was seeing it. The sterile light of the hospital room reflected off the screen. But Eleanor saw nothing but the undeniable proof of her own ugliness. Set against the quiet grace of the boy she had terrorized, the regret was no longer just a sound in her head. It was no longer a fleeting image. It had a name now, and everyone in the world seemed to know it but her. The viral street Ain. The shame was a physical sensation. It started as a cold dread in the pit of Eleanor's stomach and radiated outwards, making her skin feel clammy and thin. She had spent a lifetime building a reputation on a foundation of respectability and order. She was Eleanor Vance, the diligent auditor, the responsible neighbor, the law-abiding citizen. She paid her taxes on time. She returned her shopping carts. She had never even gotten a speeding ticket. Now, that entire structure had crumbled. The woman in the video, that wasn't an imposter. It was her, the raw, unfiltered version of herself that lived beneath the surface of polite society. She was a bully, a bigot, and the entire world was her jury. For the first time, she had to confront the ugly truth that her carefully maintained order was not about safety. It was about prejudice. A prejudice so deeply ingrained, she hadn't even recognized it in herself until it was played back for her in high definition. Miles away, in a small, tidy duplex that could have fit into Eleanor's living room, Julian Hayes was not feeling like a hero. Have felt exposed. At school, the hallways buzzed. Kids he'd never spoken to before would give him a thumbs up or a knowing nod. Others would whisper as he walked by. He couldn't tell if they were admiring him or pitying him. Both felt equally uncomfortable. He just wanted to be invisible again. To go back to being the quiet kid who was good at math. The boy with a fledgling business plan sketched out in a notebook. His mother, Simone watched him with a hawk's eye. Her anger was a quiet, simmering force. It wasn't directed at Julian, or even entirely at Eleanor. It was an anger towards a world that could turn her son's act of basic human decency into a public spectacle. That evening, as they sat at their small kitchen table, she saw him staring blankly at his dinner. "You know you did the right thing, right?" she said, her voice gentle but firm. Julian poked at his mashed potatoes. "I guess, but why does it feel so weird? Everyone's looking at me, like I'm a character in a movie or something." Simone reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "Because in this world, Julian," she said, her voice heavy with a lifetime of experience, "sometimes the simplest act of kindness from a boy who looks like you is treated like a miracle. It shouldn't be, but it is." She had raised him to be strong and kind, to walk through the world with his head held high. She just had never prepared for the possibility that his kindness would put him in the spotlight, making him a target for both praise and suspicion. She was proud, and she was terrified. A few days later, the first envelopes began to arrive at Eleanor's silent, perfect house. They weren't get-well cards. They were bills. The ambulance ride, the emergency room services, the orthopedic specialist, the x-rays. As a former auditor, Eleanor understood numbers. They were clean, absolute, unemotional. The cost of a few seconds of unbridled fury, the price tag on her prejudice. She could pay it. Of course, Arthur had left her more than comfortable, but the number still made her flinch. It was a tangible, quantifiable consequence. A fine, levied not by the HOA, but by a much higher authority. She thought of the Hayes family, of their small duplex, and the weary look in Simone's eyes. A bill like this wouldn't be an inconvenience for them. It would be a catastrophe. The financial gap between her world and theirs was suddenly stark and vast. The final blow came not in an envelope, but through a phone call. It was Preston Finch, the president of the Kingsgate Homeowners Association, HOA. His voice was smooth, polished, and completely devoid of warmth. He didn't ask about her ankle. He didn't ask how she was feeling. He went straight to business. "Eleanor, this situation has become problematic for the community. The optics are terrible." "Preston, she began, but he cut her off. "The board feels we need to issue a formal statement," he continued, his tone clinical, something to distance the association from the incident. "To make it clear that the Homeowners Association HOA does not condone this type of behavior, and that Kingsgate is a welcoming community for all." Eleanor felt the cold dread return. He wasn't calling as a neighbor. He was calling as a risk manager. She wasn't a person in crisis. She was a liability. She hadn't just broken her ankle and humiliated herself. She had tarnished the brand. She had left a stain on the pristine image of Kingsgate, and it was clear that the board's primary concern was not her well-being, but how quickly they could scrub that stain away. The misguided apology. Guilt is a powerful motivator. For Eleanor, it was a practical problem demanding a practical solution. Awake after her discharge, navigating the world clumsily on a pair of aluminum crutches, she executed her plan. She drove her pristine sedan out of the manicured perfection of Kingsgate and into a part of town she had only ever passed through on her way to the interstate. The houses here were smaller, closer together. Their lawns, a patchwork of green and brown. It wasn't chaotic. It was just lived in. She parked in front of the Hayes duplex. On the passenger seat sat two items she believed constituted a complete and logical resolution. The first was a large wicker basket from an expensive gourmet shop, filled with imported cheeses, artisanal crackers, and sparkling cider. A gesture of goodwill. The second was a crisp, white envelope. Inside was a cashier's check made out to Simone Hayes for $10,000. A gesture of compensation. In her auditor's mind, she had assessed the damage's emotional distress, public exposure, and calculated a fair settlement. This, she believed, was how you closed the books on a terrible mistake. Simone Hayes opened the door. She wasn't smiling, but her expression wasn't hostile either. It was weary, guarded. She led Eleanor into a small living room that was modest but impeccably clean, filled with family photos and the lingering scent of cinnamon. Eleanor, awkward on her crutches, remained standing. She launched into the apology she had rehearsed in the car. It was formal, stilted. It sounded less like a confession and more like a corporate statement. "Miss Hayes," she began, "I am here to formally apologize for my behavior on the afternoon of the incident. My actions were unacceptable and not in keeping with the standards of our community." She presented the gift basket, a small token of my sincere regret. Then, she held out the white envelope. "And this is to compensate for any distress my actions may have caused your son and your family." Simone did not take it. She looked at the envelope in Eleanor's hand. Then her gaze lifted, meeting Eleanor's directly. Her eyes were clear and steady. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence in the small room was heavier than any words. "Mrs. Vance," Simone finally said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "Like solid steel? I appreciate the gesture, but the worth of my son cannot be written on a check." She took a small step back. "Qui a subtle but definitive retreat." His safety when he walks down the street, his dignity as a human being, you can't buy those things back. Not for him. And not for you. She looked at Eleanor, not with anger, but with a profound and devastating clarity. "We don't want your money." The refusal hit Eleanor with more force than the concrete sidewalk. It was a shock to her entire system. In her world, every problem had a price. Every liability could be settled. She had offered a solution. A clean transaction to zero out the balance of her wrongdoing. And it had been rejected. Utterly. She left the house in a daze, the heavy gift basket and the even heavier envelope still in her possession. She sat in her car, the engine off, staring at the unfamiliar street. For the first time, Eleanor Vance was forced to confront a truth that her wealth and privilege had always shielded her from. Some wounds are not financial. Some debts can never be repaid. They can only be carried. She understood now that true atonement wasn't a transaction. It was something else entirely, something she had no idea how to begin. Meanwhile, back in the quiet, orderly world of King's Gate, Preston Finch and the board of the HOA were busy. They weren't thinking about atonement. They were thinking about prevention. The incident, in their view, was a warning sign, a breach in the perimeter. They worried it might encourage others, unvetted individuals, people who didn't understand the rules. They began drafting a new bylaw, couched in the neutral language of security and policy, designed to ensure that a boy like Julian Hayes would never have a reason to walk their streets again. Simone Hayes turned down a sum of money that could have changed her family's life. She chose dignity over dollars. If you were in her position, facing the person who had harmed your child, but who was also offering an easy way out, what would you have done? Would you have taken the check? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd really like to know. The invisible wall. 2 weeks after her fall, an email landed in Eleanor's inbox. The subject line was sterile and official notice of special meeting of the King's Gate HOA board. He thing us? Still clumsy from the lingering shock. Clicked it open. Attached was a PDF document, proposed amendment to community bylaws. She read the language. It was cold, corporate, and meticulously neutral. Bylaw 11B, to preserve community safety and resident privacy. All forms of commercial activity, advertisement, or door-to-door solicitation are prohibited unless expressly licensed and approved by the Homeowners Association HOA Board. The words were a carefully constructed shield, but Eleanor saw right through it. She saw the target, a 16-year-old boy with a stack of flyers. The bylaw wasn't a shield. It was a wall. An invisible wall designed to keep Julian Hayes and his modest ambitions out of Kingsgate for good. She could picture the meeting where this was conceived. Preston Finch, sitting at the head of the long boardroom table, wouldn't have used ugly words. He never did. Preston wasn't a man of overt slurs. He was a man of spreadsheets and data points. He wouldn't have spoken of race. He would have spoken of maintaining property values. He would have mentioned statistical crime rates in adjacent zip codes. He would have talked about unregulated commercial variables and potential liability issues. To Preston, Julian Hayes wasn't a boy. He was an anomaly. An unpredictable data point that threatened the carefully calculated equation of Kingsgate's desirability. In Preston's world, prejudice wasn't an ugly feeling. It was a logical risk management strategy. And Eleanor knew, with a sickening certainty, that she had been the one to put that variable on his radar. She had sounded the alarm. And now, the entire system was mobilizing to neutralize the perceived threat. A profound weariness settled over her. Her first instinct was to retreat. To disappear? It would be so easy. She could resign from her position as treasurer. She could stop attending the meetings. She could let the current of community consensus carry this injustice forward, while she remained safely on the shore. She could sell her house, move away, and leave the whole ugly mess behind. She could simply be quiet. Quiet was safe. Quiet was what she was good at. The thought of doing nothing was both a comfort and a quiet poison. Her mistake, her ugly, public mistake, had started a chain reaction. Her personal fear was being codified into community law. It was a monstrous legacy, and the thought of letting it stand felt like a second, deeper failure. She picked up the phone and dialed her son. David. This time, she wasn't calling out of shame. She was calling for an anchor. She didn't tell him about the proposed bylaw. Not directly. She just talked, her voice low, speaking of feeling lost, of not knowing what the right thing to do was anymore. David listened patiently from his home 1,000 miles away. He had seen the worst of her on that video. Yet he had never condemned her. You know, Mom, he said, his voice gentle. Growing up, you always taught me to follow the rules, to color inside the lines. You always chose the safest path. For us, and for you, Eleanor felt a defensive prickle. There's nothing wrong with being safe. David, no, he agreed softly. There isn't, but you're not in the same place anymore. The lines have been erased. There was a pause. And then he said the words that would echo in her mind for days. Maybe this is a chance to do it differently. She hung up the phone, the silence of her perfect house pressing in on her. A chance to do it differently. The words were terrifying. They were an invitation to step off the safe path she had walked her entire life. It meant choosing conflict over comfort. It meant walking back into the very fire she had started. It meant facing Preston Finch and the entire HOA. It was, in every sense, the most illogical and unsafe choice she could possibly make, and for the first time in a very long time, it felt like the only choice that mattered. The business plan. A decision, once made, has its own momentum. Eleanor drove back to the Hayes duplex the next day. This time, there were no gourmet baskets. No envelopes fat with guilt money. She carried only a leather-bound portfolio and a lifetime of professional experience. Attonnement. She was beginning to understand. Wasn't about apologies. It was about action. Simone Hayes answered the door with the same guarded weariness as before. But this time, there was a flicker of surprise in her eyes. Eleanor, leaning on a single crutch now, didn't waste time with pleasantries. Miss Hayes, Simone, she said, correcting herself. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but I need to speak with you and Julian. It's about the HOA. Inside, at the same small kitchen table, the air was thick with mistrust. Julian sat with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "I can't undo what I did," Eleanor began, her voice low and steady. "But what I did is started something else. The Homeowners Association HOA is proposing a new bylaw, a rule that will effectively ban any kind of door-to-door service that isn't pre-approved." She looked directly at Julian. "It's aimed at you, and it will pass. I know these people. I know how this system works." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "It will pass," she repeated. "Unless we give them a reason not to. Unless we show them that your business isn't a threat. It's an asset." This was her offer. Not money, but knowledge. "I want to help you," she said. "Her gaze unwavering. I want to be your business advisor. We will turn neighborly needs from an idea on a flyer into a legitimate, registered, and insured business. We will create a professional proposal, complete with financial projections and testimonials. We will present it to the board not as a kid asking for permission, but as a businessman making a case." The suspicion in the room was palpable. Simone stared at her, searching for the angle. The hidden motive. "Why would you do this?" she asked, her voice skeptical. "Because I started this," Eleanor said simply. There was no other answer. The process began slowly, tentatively. The first few meetings were stiff and formal. Eleanor was all business. She didn't talk about feelings or forgiveness. She talked about liability insurance. She talked about registering for a tax identification number. She spoke of profit and loss statements. She treated Julian not as a victim she pitied, but as a young entrepreneur with a viable concept. This clinical, professional approach was, unexpectedly, the very thing that began to break down the walls. Julian, who had been bracing for more awkward apologies, found himself being challenged. He was being asked about his target demographic, his pricing strategy, his 5-year goals. Eleanor's respect for his idea was evident in the rigor of her questions. It was the first time an adult, other than his mother, had taken his ambition seriously. The turning point came during their third meeting. Julian was hunched over his laptop, struggling to make a spreadsheet calculate his projected earnings. He sighed in frustration. "I can't get the formula to work," he mumbled, more to himself than to her. Eleanor wheeled her office chair over beside him. The scent of her crisp, clean perfume was a foreign presence in their small kitchen. She leaned in, her finger pointing to a cell on the screen. "You're trying to sum the whole column," she said, her voice quiet. "You need to use a conditional function. Here, let me show you." For a few moments, the tension between them vanished. There was no Kingsgate Karen and no black teen from the video. There was only an experienced professional sharing her knowledge with an eager student. She showed him the formula, explaining the logic behind it step by step. He listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he successfully executed the command, a small, genuine smile broke across his face. It was a tiny moment, insignificant, but it was the first stone laid in the foundation of a bridge. In that small, shared victory over a stubborn spreadsheet, something shifted. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something far more practical, and perhaps more powerful. It was the beginning of a partnership into the lion's den. The following weeks transformed the Hayes small kitchen table into a strategic command center. A quiet, determined energy replaced the initial tension. For the first time since Arthur's death, Eleanor felt a flicker of her old professional self. The sharp, analytical mind that had once hunted for financial discrepancies was now being used for a different purpose. Not to tear down, but to build up. She drilled Julian relentlessly. She taught him how to turn his passion into a presentation, his ideas into bullet points. They role-played the meeting, with Eleanor playing the part of a skeptical board member, They will ask you about your overhead costs. Julian, she'd say, her tone crisp. They will question your experience. You need to have the answers. Not emotional answers. Factual ones. Julian, who had started as a shy, reserved teenager, slowly began to find his voice. He was learning more than just business. He was learning how to stand his ground, how to advocate for himself in a world that was predisposed to dismiss him. One evening, Eleanor laid out their core strategy. A perfect business plan isn't enough, she explained, her voice low. You have to understand the people you're speaking to. Preston Finch and his allies on the board don't operate on morality. They operate on a different set of principles. She ticked them off on her fingers. 1, property values. 2, legal liability. 3, public image. Their proposal was engineered to address each point. For property values, they included a section detailing how neighborly needs would specifically help elderly residents maintain their home's exterior's lawn care, cultivating, exterior window washing, thereby enhancing the neighborhood's overall aesthetic appeal, an asset, not a detriment. For legal liability, Eleanor guided Julian through the process of securing a comprehensive business liability insurance policy. The certificate of insurance was printed on high-quality paper, ready to be presented. It was a professional move, a signal that this was not some kid's hobby. It was a legitimate enterprise that took responsibility seriously, minimizing any potential risk for the Homeowners Association HOA. The third point, public image, was Eleanor's masterstroke. She made quiet phone calls. She spoke to a retired professor who lived down the street from her, a man who had expressed his disgust over the viral video. She contacted a younger woman on the social committee who she knew was eager to make Kingsgate feel more inclusive. She didn't ask them to fight her battle. She simply told them that Julian would be presenting his case at the meeting, and that a friendly face in the audience wouldn't hurt. She was planting seeds of support in the very garden she had once policed so fiercely. One night, after a long session working on financial projections, Julian finally went to his room, exhausted. Eleanor was packing up her portfolio when Simone placed a cup of tea on the table in front of her. He's more confident, Simone said. It wasn't a question. I haven't seen him this focused on anything before. He's a smart kid, Eleanor replied, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from the cup. He just needed a framework. They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment. It's not easy, Simone said softly. Raising a black son in this country, you spend so much time teaching him how to be careful, how to make himself smaller so he won't be seen as a threat. And then you have to find a way to teach him how to be brave at the same time. She looked at Eleanor. Her expression opened for the first time. Thank you for helping him be brave. Eleanor felt a tightness in her chest. For the first time in years, she shared something real. She spoke of her own loneliness, of the crushing silence in her large, empty house. It wasn't a confession seeking forgiveness. It was a simple, human admission, a moment of shared vulnerability between two very different women. Her new resolve was tested a few days later. Preston Finch appeared at her front door. Unannounced. He didn't come inside. He stood on her pristine porch, his posture rigid. Eleanor, he said, his voice a low warning. I've heard what you're doing. You are actively working against the interests of this community. Your loyalty should be to the HOA. The Eleanor of a month ago would have crumbled. She would have apologized, deferred, and retreated, but this Eleanor stood taller. She looked him directly in the eye, her own voice as cold and clear as his. I am defending the interests of a member of this community. Preston, she stated, a young man who has every right to be here. I thought that was the entire purpose of an HOA. The night before the meeting. That night, sleep was a stranger in the Hayes household. Julian lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the slides of his presentation replaying in his mind. The confidence he'd felt while practicing with Eleanor had evaporated. replaced by a gnawing dread. He wasn't a businessman. He was a 16-year-old kid. And tomorrow, he had to walk into a room full of adults who had already judged him once. For a fleeting moment, he wanted to quit. He wanted to tell Eleanor it was a mistake, that he would just find a different way to earn money for his programming camp. He got out of bed and found his mother in the living room, reading under a dim lamp. He didn't have to say anything. She saw the exhaustion and fear on his face. "I don't know if I can do this, Mom," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "Everyone's going to be staring at me. They're all going to be thinking about that day." Simone closed her book and pulled him into a hug, her arms a circle of unwavering strength. "Listen to me, Julian," she said, her voice soft but fierce. "You don't have to be a hero. You don't have to change the world tomorrow. But sometimes, just standing up for yourself, for your own dream, is the bravest thing a person can do. No matter what happens in that room, you will have done that, and I will be right there with you." Eleanor wasn't sleeping either. In the cold, quiet expanse of her house, she sat at Arthur's desk, the desk lamp casting a small pool of light on Julian's finalized proposal. She went over it one last time, checking for typos, for any weakness they might have missed. Her anxiety wasn't just for Julian, it was for herself. For 10 years, the HOA had been her sanctuary, its rules her scripture. Tomorrow, she would stand up in front of her peers and challenge that entire system. She would become, in their eyes, a traître. Her gaze fell on a framed photograph on the corner of the desk. It was of her and Arthur, taken on a trip to the mountains years ago. They were both smiling. He had always been the braver one, the one who took risks, who encouraged her to step outside her comfortable blanketed. Endable.com. Ordered world. The map is not the territory. Ellie, he used to say. She had spent the years since his death clinging to the map, afraid to look at the world around her. She traced the outline of his face with her finger. What would he think of her now? And for the first time, she felt a sense of certainty. He wouldn't be disappointed. He would be proud. This, she realized, was perhaps the person he had always hoped she would become. A woman of courage, not just of compliance. The next morning, just an hour before they were set to leave for the meeting, there was a soft knock on the Hayes front door. Julian opened it to find Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow from down the street whose hedges he had trimmed the week before. She was a quiet woman, someone Julian had only exchanged a few pleasantries with. In her frail hands, she held a plate covered in aluminum foil. "I just wanted to bring you these," she said, her voice thin but kind. She peeled back the foil to reveal a dozen freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. "I heard about the meeting. I believe in you." Young man. Julian was speechless. He took the plate, the warmth seeping through the foil into his cold, nervous hands. It was such a small thing, a plate of cookies, but in that moment, it felt like everything. It was a single voice of support in a sea of anticipated judgment. It was the strength he needed to walk into that room. Eleanor chose to confront a system she had been a part of for a decade. Julian, a 16-year-old boy, is about to stand before a room of adults to defend his dream. On paper, it is an uneven fight, but they are not alone. They have each other. And they have the quiet support of a few good neighbors. And I believe they have your support as well. If you are still listening, please help me by commenting the number 1 below, so I know that I still have friends on this journey with me. Your presence is the greatest encouragement for me to continue telling the final part of Eleanor and Julian's story and to see if courage can, in fact, win against prejudice. The voice in the room. The community clubhouse smelled of stale coffee and anxiety. The air was thick with unspoken tensions. Preston Finch sat at the head of a long folding table, flanked by the other board members. A looked composed, authoritative. He held the gavel, the symbol of his power. In the front row sat Eleanor, Julian, and Simone. They were a small, isolated island in a sea of neutral and hostile faces. Then, it was Julian's turn. He walked to the small lectern at the front of the room. His business proposal clutched in his hand. His heart hammered against his ribs. He could feel every eye in the room on him. He looked out and saw a blur of faces. Then he found Eleanor. She gave him a short, sharp nod. An anchor. It took a deep breath. His voice trembled on the first few words. But then he found his rhythm. He didn't talk about the video. He didn't talk about racism or fairness. He talked about business. He clicked through the slides Eleanor had helped him create. He spoke of his service offerings, from lawn mowing to technology support for senior citizens. He presented his modest but professional financial projections. He held up the certificate for his liability insurance. He even included a slide with a testimonial from Mrs. Gable about his hedge trimming. He wasn't a victim asking for pity. He was a professional making his pitch. When he finished, there was a moment of surprised silence. He had exceeded their expectations. Preston Finch was the first to speak. His smile thin, very impressive. Son, but this is a residential community, not a business park. What guarantees do we have about your reliability? He began a barrage of pointed questions, designed to trip Julian up, to make him look inexperienced and unprofessional. But for every question, Julian had an answer. Eleanor had prepared him. They had rehearsed this. He answered calmly, citing the policies and procedures outlined in his own proposal. Frustrated, Preston pushed harder. And what happens if a resident has a complaint who is held accountable? A 16-year-old boy. Before Julian could answer, Eleanor stood up. A hush fell over the room. This was the moment. She was no longer just an advisor in the front row. She was Eleanor Vance, the treasurer of the HOA. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke with the calm, measured authority of an auditor presenting her findings. As the treasurer, she began, her voice carrying across the room. I feel obligated to point out the potential financial and legal ramifications of this proposed bylaw. She looked directly at the board, denying a legitimate, insured business proposal from a legal resident, particularly a minor from a protected class, based on vague and unsubstantiated security concerns, opens the Homeowners Association HOA to significant legal exposure. A discrimination lawsuit, whether successful or not, would cost this community tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees, not to mention the damage to our reputation. She let the financial threat hang in the air for a moment before her tone softened. But this isn't just about money. Preston, she said, her gaze sweeping across the residence. This is about who we are. For years, we've told ourselves we are a community that values safety. But are we building walls to keep threats out? Or are we building them to keep neighbors from knowing one another? Are we a community that builds fences? Or one that builds bridges? Her words changed the atmosphere in the room. It was as if she had given people permission to speak their conscience. Mrs. Gable, the woman with the cookies, stood up, her voice shaky but clear. That boy, Julian, he helped me clear my overgrown garden last week. He worked hard, and he was polite. He's a good kid. Another man, a retired Professor Eleanor had called, spoke up. Frankly, I feel safer knowing there are ambitious young people like this in our neighborhood. Not fewer. The tide had turned. The silent majority was no longer silent. Preston Finch, seeing his support evaporate, had no choice but to call the vote. Hands went up around the room. First a few, then a dozen. Then a clear majority. Preston's face was a tight mask. He cleared his throat. The motion to approve Bylaw 11B has failed. A quiet, collective exhale seemed to pass through the room. It was not a cheer of victory. It was the sound of a held breath being released. The new perfection. There was no applause. There were no triumphant speeches. The meeting ended, and people simply filed out, a quiet unease hanging in the air. The story didn't conclude with a dramatic embrace or a tearful, cinematic moment of forgiveness. Change, Eleanor was learning, was a much slower, more complicated process. Preston Finch remained the president of the HOA, but his authority was diminished. He had been challenged and defeated, not by an outside force, but from within. Kingsgate was still a neighborhood governed by rules, its lawns still meticulously manicured, but the invisible wall had a crack in it now, a small fissure that let in a little more light, a little more air. The vote hadn't magically erased prejudice, but it had refused to institutionalize it. It was not a victory. It was a beginning. The week after the meeting, Eleanor submitted her resignation as treasurer. The spreadsheets and violation notices no longer held any appeal. The need to control, the obsession that had driven her for so long, had simply faded. It was replaced by something quieter and more purposeful. She continued to meet with Julian, not as a crisis manager, but as a proper mentor. His business, Neighborly Needs, began to flourish within the manicured confines of Kingsgate. What started as a trickle of jobs from the few supporters at the meeting soon became a steady stream. People who had once viewed him with suspicion now saw him as a local fixture. He was Julian, the kid who was great with computers and didn't complain about weeding. His presence became a quiet symbol of the community's small but significant shift. The relationship between Eleanor and the Hayes family found a new, delicate equilibrium. It wasn't a deep friendship. Not yet. The wounds were too fresh for that. It was an alliance built on a shared, difficult history and a mutual, hard-won respect. Once a month, Eleanor would invite Julian and Simone to her house for dinner. The first few times were awkward. The conversation stilted. The silence of the large dining room, a testament to the gulf that still existed between them. But slowly, tentatively, it became more comfortable. They found common ground in discussions about Julian's future, Simone's demanding work schedule, and even, sometimes, Eleanor's memories of Arthur. There was, eventually, laughter in that cavernous room. Eleanor was still alone, but she was no longer lonely. The silence in her house felt less like an absence and more like a space for peace. She joined the community garden club, finding a quiet satisfaction in nurturing growth rather than policing decay. She started volunteering at the local library, helping adults learn to read. She was building things. Her ankle healed, leaving behind a faint ache that would flare up on rainy days. She still walked the same route through the neighborhood each morning, but her focus had changed. She no longer scanned for imperfections. She looked for signs of life. One crisp autumn afternoon, she was sitting on her front porch, reading a novel. She looked up and saw Julian walking down the street, pushing a lawnmower. He wasn't handing out flyers anymore. He was heading to a job. He saw her watching and gave a small, easy wave. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, unforced smile, and waved back. She looked around at the pristine houses, at the flawless green lawns, at the perfect, orderly world she had once fought so fiercely to protect. She realized the definition of perfection had changed for her. It wasn't the absence of flaws. It wasn't the rigid adherence to a set of arbitrary rules. The new perfection was this: a simple, quiet moment of connection, a shared history that had been painful, but had led to something better. Her life's biggest regret had not been erased. It couldn't be. The video was still online. The comments were still there. But it no longer felt like a stain. It felt like a scar, a permanent reminder of a wound that had, against all odds, healed into something stronger. It had been transformed into a purpose, into something that felt, remarkably, like hope. What does it truly mean to make amends? Is it a grand gesture? Or is it found in the quiet, consistent actions that follow a terrible mistake? We saw Eleanor, a woman lost in her own rules, and Julian, a boy whose simple act of grace gave her a second chance. Perhaps the most powerful moment wasn't in the heated HOA meeting, but in the quiet of a kitchen, when a shared frustration over a spreadsheet began to build the first fragile planks of a bridge between them. This story reminds us that our biggest regrets don't have to be the end. They can be the beginning of a deeper understanding if we are brave enough to face them. What part of Eleanor and Julian's journey resonated with you the most? We would be honored to read your thoughts in the comments below. If you appreciate stories that explore the complexities of the human heart, please consider subscribing to Deepu Cotter Stories. Thank you for being here and for sharing this journey with us.